Okay, hello and welcome to the first Cheiron seminar of 2025. And the topic of the seminar is looking at the Warhorse in the early modern and modern Europe. So we are going to cover a very long time span from the um, late 15th, early 16th century and going up to the early 20th century, right up to the First World War. We have three wonderful speakers. Dr. Pierre-Henry Bas, Lucy Betteridge, and Dr. Jurg Gassmann. We will start in a chronological order with Dr. Pierre-Henry Bas talking about horses in Pietro del Monte. Then we will kind of fast forward to the 20th century and then return somewhat back to in time. We will keep all the questions for the discussion till the end of the seminar, but Lucy might have to leave, so if you have urgent questions to Lucy, you can ask them either in the chat or she can or email address if it's something which if she leaves immediately after her paper cannot answer those questions. But you're also welcome to use the chat function, put your questions there if you want them to stay, okay? So let's move on to our first paper. Pierre-Henry Bas has held a doctorate in medieval history since 2015. His thesis, titled Combat at the End of the Middle Ages and in the Early Modern Period, Theories and Practices, focuses on historical fencing on foot and on horseback, drawing on the study of fencing treatises and gestural experimentation. He is the founder and president of the Research and Experimentation in Historical and Technical Gestures Association, active in several cities in northern France as an instructor in mounted fencing at the Institut de Cheval de l'Équitation Portugaise. He is also a research engineer at the University of Lille, within the Federation for Research in Visual Sciences and Cultures, and his work focuses on applying new technologies and artificial intelligence to historical treatises on dance and fencing. And today he will look at horseback fighting in Pietro Monte's Collectanea. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Anastasia and Jurg, to invite me to speak today. To begin, sorry for my strong French accent. I'm not used to speak in English. La culpa. So, I will speak about Pietro del Monte to horseback fighting in Pietro del Monte's Collectanea's 5009 from training to the reality of pitch battle. Pietro del Monte is certainly one of the most famous Italian condottieri of the Renaissance, notably through two of his books, the De Dignoscendis Omnibus on the Appraisal of Man, published in 1492, and principally the Exerciturum Atque Artis Militaris Collectanea in 1509, published after his death. In this last work, that we may translate as collections of exercise and about military art, the horse and its use is of paramount importance. Indeed, despite the revolution in infantry warfare during the 15th century, principally due to the use of pikes and the increasing role of gunpowder, the cavalry is still a necessity on the field. Horseback fighting is used in several contexts, two of which are particularly detailed by Pietro del Monte. The first is that of the duel 1 versus 1, like you can see on my PowerPoint. The second, which is a pitch battle, is a little more succinct. For Monte, handling weapons in various duel scenarios seems to be a pertinent exercise and good preparation for the more specific framework of the pitch battle. Technically, what distinguishes this true context is the availability of space and the freedom of movement of the fighters. For example, in a duel, Monte explains that the fighter focuses on a single opponent, observing his weaknesses and the gap in these protections in order to strike them. In contrast, in a pitched battle and mass warfare, the enemies defend themselves mutually and bodies jostle each other. It's a real melee and therefore it is impossible to focus on only one opponent and thereby risk getting hit and wounded by another. Proper preparation is absolutely necessary in order to be ready for the different types of confrontations. This includes using an adequate outfit in the form of arms and armor, a point very dear to Pietro del Monte, who gives you a lot of details on their different forms and material. Concerning cavalry, we may differentiate through this work two types of riders. The first are outfits with light armor and protections, perhaps in a Hispanic or Oriental fashion. The second wears the white harness, the full plate armor and hind bodies, the traditional heavy cavalry. The equipment can be further modified depending on the expected tactical situation of the fighter, such as a frontal engagement or a surprise attack. Different tactical configurations may occur in war, whether in pitched battle or during skirmishes called scaramucciare. This is also true in regulate duels, whether deadly or not, for which there are many different conventions. These conventions and regulations are very important, as they define what is allowed or forbidden, and therefore which techniques and tactics are available to the fighter. For example, in a duel at the barrier or in a closed field, Monte mentions that it is essentially to know if it is allowed to strike and kill the opponent's horse. This tactic is not usually allowed in dueling conventions, as Monte specifies, but remains one of the most effective actions to defend an enemy, and as such, it is important to know if it is an option. In contrast to the regulate duel, war includes less honorable fighting tactics of two sorts. One is harassment and evasion, including tactical retreats and feint flights, at which light cavalry excels. The second is a confrontation of a rider against a footman, regarded as not honorable unless the footman is a rider that had been previously dismounted during the fight. Dueling in harness generally applies to different contexts: pitched battle, skirmish, and standardized duel. In all of these contexts, specific training is required, which also depends on the equipment used. For example, allowing harassment tactics can lead to choosing to practice handling the light lever shield of Moorish fashion, the adarga, and the light spear, the ginita, like you can see on this side. The latter can be thrown, which led Monte to give you some valuable advice on how to throw the spear or the javelin, which can be done on foot and horseback. In that last case, the rider stands on the two stirrups adjusted to the same length. The feet are set firmly in the stirrups, the arm is stretched on the body, and the body turns during the throw. This method should be prevent the rider from tipping forwards or backwards. At the opposite end of the spectrum, choosing frontal combat in heavy harness usually means using the heavy lens and training in the art of jousting. This subject is quite well developed in Monte's work, even if it seems to be limited to traditional jousting, with the lens cross over to the left, both fighters reading past each other on the left and using specific equipment. Lens, where the riders may, for example, pass each other on the right, a situation that we find notably in the German fight books of the same periods, attributed to the master at arms Johannes Lichtenauer. Monte's reading, however, seems to be closer to the reality of the field and of war than the usual German technical literature. The Condottiere is one of the very few authors to explain the use of typical heavy cavalry weapons, such as warmers, namely bec de Corbin or bec de Faucon, ravens or falcon beak in French sauces. This type of weapon is sometimes substituted with the short axe, asa, or maza. The other hand-to-hand weapon is a sword. This weapon follows the same principles as other arms, be it on some feints based on the observation that no ground defensive position is absolutely safe. Thus, he advised constant and quick movement in order to create a window of opportunity to strike the opponent in an uncovered target after a faint threat. The sword can be replaced by the tuck, mukro, a weapon typical of this period. The protection offered by the harness, especially for the face and the left arm, increases the opportunity for wrestling or disarming the opponent. We'll see later on that the protected arm can be used to parry or deflect blows as a shield, and the lighter blows may be inert. An armored fight, blows must be dealt with great force. Regarding the fight between a footman and rider, which can recall the latest works of Paul Hector Meyer in the middle of the 16th century. These suggested tactics seems to be very logical and depends on the weapons and equipment used by the rider and the footman. All these practices are well described in the work of Monte, and the reader accustomed to the literature of German fight books will find in it easy to understand. What is more interesting are his reasons on why one should train in this exercise. Sometimes his justifications are hygienist, but more often they are martial. Training a man of war requires developing endurance and strength. For this purpose, wrestling is regarded as fundamental, like another great figure of the 15th century, the King Dom Duarte of Portugal, who wrote the Book of the Art of Riding with any type of saddle around 1434, a book about horse riding, in which he argues in favor of the practice of wrestling. One must have the handling of different weapons of foot and other practices which require a horse to this basic training. This is primarily horseback riding, even if Monte is laconic on riding it safe and prefers to ride on equestrian vaulting. This practice consists essentially of acrobatic moves performed on a harnessed horse. The high pommels of the medieval saddles are grips with one or two hands, and the rider jumps on and around the horse. Finally, choosing a horse is just as important as choosing one's equipment. Monte is one of the rare authors to state the importance of the physiognomy, personality, idiosyncrasy, and behavior of the fighter. Naturally, he does the same brief. The horse with a good spirit, brave, trained, and especially stronger, more powerful and taller than that of the opponent, offers a significant advantage in a fight. The important advantage is the reason why neutralizing it with a disabling or killing blow is a priority, hence the importance of knowing if hitting the horse is allowed in a duel, as Monte state. This is especially true if the rider is armored and therefore harder to harm. Thus, the chapters dealing with horses in Monte's works oscillate between purely artificial physical disciplines like vaulting on the horse and very pragmatic techniques that take into consideration all possible options in order to quickly knock off the opposing rider. All in all, in order to do well in duel of war, the athletic exercise of wrestling and vaulting and the handling of weapons in duel and jousting are all necessary practices. Indeed, Monte places a lot of importance on versatility. The key is to know how to transfer skill from one art to another. Those who practice an art only in a single manner will remain eternal beginners. By understanding how Monte looked at horseback fighting, we can conduct a step-by-step study of the various techniques he exposed. We'll take just two examples. First, the various steps of typical chivalric fighting, including the use of the spear and other shorter weapons. Second, the equipment and some tactical and technical choices for light cavalry. Horseback fighting goes through three stages directly related to the combat distance of measures involved. We can also find this in German fighting through the use of the lance, the longsword, and wrestling. The first is used as the true knight meet, as in jousting. In the second step, each fighter tries to dominate their adversary and hit him with a sword or mace. Finally, at the shortest distance, wrestling is used to either disarm, lock the opponent's arm, or throw him off his horse. The different tactics are very well described. Some are quite similar to those that can be found in German fightbooks. Especially for arm wrestling, where the opponents try to twitch each other's arm into different locking positions with both horses facing the same direction as in a pursuit or in opposite direction when coming face to face. However, the most remarkable element in the description of the Turkish cut or Turkish how in German sources, a blow with a sword which Monte also attributes to the Turks and the Moors. This cut consists of hitting the opponent a second time in the back, in the event that he has parried the first frontal strike, and is done as the two riders pass each other. Monte also offers a key to reading horseback fighting, which is only hypothetical and implied in German fight books. A fight between two knights, each equipped with lance and sword, may be divided in three phases. Each phase is characterized by the use of one type of weapon. In the first phase, the goal of a horse rider is to thrust at the opponent with a lance. To do this, he should always point his tip against him and thrust him at the face or chest. This type of combat must be linear, even if in reality the horse is at a slight angle, as for jousting, in order to receive full frontal impact. The second phase of fighting is done with a mace or the warmer, which is sometimes held in both hands. Once again, Monte is very clear. in a white harness, it is necessary to hitch with as much force as possible to wound the opponent. That is not the case with lighter equipment, where harsh strikes are potentially harmful. Moreover, wearing a harness not only allows the fighter to injure light blow to the skull, but also to parry blows with the left arm, so as to attack simultaneously with a weapon in the right hand. When fighting with the shorter weapons, the goal is to keep one's horse head facing the opponent, even if there are occasional frontal pieces where riders crush each other on the right. Ideally, one should try to get to an advantageous position facing the group of the opposing animal and then hit the enemy in the back. The fight is therefore essentially circular, like in a dog fight. Alongside these bludgeoning weapons, that can also be used to parry or hook the opponent. Swords and tucks are used against the gap of the cuirass, which are the same as those when fighting in armor on foot. The sight and the some type of helmet, the visor, the throat, or the armpit. This type of use of the horse is less particular than another type. I need to quick my presentation. So I will speak about a second manner of reading a horse, described in Droit's books, the so-called gineta. Still, characterized by the use of shorter stirrups and reading with bent lengths. This riding style is native of the Maghreb, which then transited through the Hispanic Peninsula and Lusitania. Riding in the gineta style is done using very different saddle, which the rider seated on the middle sections of the horse. This style, described for the first time in the work of Dom Droite, is usually used by the lighter cavalry. Monte advises using it mostly for racing and for throwing projectiles. However, this riding style can also be used for fighting or hunting. Some riders use a light spear, also called the gineta, lancea, which they hold in the middle with the right hand, like you can see on this tapestry. It is possible to do some feints with it, such as pretending to throw the spear and switching to a thrust as the opponent tries to avoid the throw. This type of weapon can also be held in the left and right hands at the same time to thrust with force. The left hand also holds the leather shield or adaga, which should always serve as a screen against the opponent, but without ever obscuring one's own view. The gear can be used both for harassing and fleeing before force. Against a stronger and better armed cavalry, Monte explains how to pretend to accept a charge from an enemy lancer by coming to meet him and then dodging him at the last moment. For Monte, skirmishing or light combat on horseback can be very similar to fighting on foot. Thus, through this pure equestrian example, we see how Monte, in his own way, fills the gaps that seem to sometimes exist between very theoretical German fight books and the reality in the field. In fact, in German fight books like Paul Meyer's works, German authors and master at arms often make the choice of multiplying techniques, theoretically covering every situation and context without going into details. Thus, can be a duel, a playful competition, or an aggressive encounter in the street. In contrast, Monte is rarely a man of war. Also, it gives less technical solution to win against an opponent in a serious context. In a more pragmatic way, Monte reminds of the importance of the mind, of working out, and of proficiency with weapons. In addition to fencing, he explains that the exercise of wrestling, vaulting, and running with or without the help of a horse aim to strengthen the body and the desire to dominate in combat. Another truth missing from other 5 books is that exercise of horse riding is essential for fighting on horseback. Therefore, the techniques that are used depend both on the material context and the type of weapons or armor that allows the techniques. Monte is one of the rare authors to show that practicing with weapons helps to prepare for dueling situations where there are limits in the freedom of the exchange through some convention or regulation. However, for Monte, military combat and pitch battle are never very far from a normalized duel. The difference is essential in the choice of the techniques used to complete the objective. A technical choice that is only possible if one has the strength, endurance, mastery, skill, and mental fortitude necessary for its application. That is why training is necessary. To conclude, the following illustration shows the complex relations between the techniques and tactics used in fighting. The fighter's skill level determines which techniques are achievable. These parameters are in direct relation with the materials and the weapon used, as well as the physical and mental conditions of the fighter. The techniques allowed in the fight are defined by the rules and conventions, but at the same time, their usefulness depends on the context, which runs from the anything goes situations of pitched battle to the more regulated encounters, like duels. Indeed, this context determines the rule and the conventions, such as the right to kill the opponent's horse mentioned earlier. This rationale is clearly visible when it comes to horseback fighting as described by Pietro del Monte, where there are great differences between light and heavy cavalry and pedestrian versus horseman. This relation between skills, weapons, techniques, and rules is also true for other martial arts from the Renaissance, where we can connect theories and practices, sword games, duels, and the reality of the war. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So this is fascinating. I like the diagram at the end. So Pietro Monte is a guy who likes going into details and having a theory underwriting, I think, basically everything. Very enjoyable. Thank you. And now we will fast forward in time and go to our second paper by Lucy Betteridge Dyson, who is a historian, author, and broadcaster with a passion for uncovering lesser-known aspects of warfare, and in particular the role of animals in conflict. And Lucy has published research which combines animal studies and military history, including her book Equine Learning Curve, Horses and Mules in British Army Transport Services during the First World War. So the floor is to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much. And yeah, sorry if I have to dip out early to everybody. I've been pretty poorly today, and it's been a manic month with 2 sick horses as well, so I'm a bit run down. I wanted to take things in a slightly different direction. So rather than talking about training and learning from an individual's point of view, or even from the horse's point of view, my research focused really on institutional learning and institutional training, as it were, and really about how the British Army learned to love its horses and to view them as comrades rather than tools, something that I've called a revolution of equine affairs, or revolution in equine affairs, which, you know, my training is as a military historian. I'm a horse lover, and my kind of interest in animal studies and animal history has melded together. A big part of what I do is about explaining how learning about horses, learning about equines in war can actually give us a much wider perspective on military operations as a whole. And for the British Army, this revolution in equine affairs culminated in an army that not only prioritised and cared extremely well for its horses and mules, but showed them a great deal of sympathetic consideration and understanding during the First World War. But before we dive into that, we got to head back a little bit, and I'll give you a little bit of history about horses and mules in the British Army. Really a major part of not just cavalry, but also logistics since the formation of the new model army in 1645. And the creation of the Army Veterinary Service actually came about 100 years after, so not until the late 1700s. And that was the real first official recognition that horses, mules in warfare needed care. They weren't just tools, they weren't just inanimate objects. Nevertheless, the attitude did prevail that they were largely seen as disposable. And of course, they were used for the cavalry, but by the 18th century, they had largely replaced oxen as a form of transportation, hauling and carrying the army into battle. And this slide here shows probably one of the most famous equine engagements of the 19th century, the charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War. The Crimean War, not a good war in which to be a horse, put it like that. Pretty catastrophic losses for the British Army. Around about 80% of the equines annually perished. A variety of reasons for it. Essentially came down to three things. One was incredibly slow purchase of remounts, so replacement horses. Because of the slowness, because of the lack of facilities and procedures around this, pretty much any old animal was selected and sent to the front, whether they were suitable for the roles that they were going to be playing or not. And then the second reason, really sort of playing into that, was the attitude toward the animals. So there was just wanton neglect from soldiers. There was insufficient fodder and a lack of proper stabling. So the horses were often just kept outside in all conditions, you know, had very little to eat. And of course, illness was rife among them. These issues in the British Army, interestingly, were not due to ignorance. There were plenty of senior staff in the military at the time who had an absolutely excellent understanding of horse care and horse mastership and horsemanship. But the War Office was slow to codify it. It just wasn't important at that stage to the British Army to put these lessons and these requirements into a formalized way and a formalized training for the troops. Despite the wartime losses and this growing contrast, of course, between the British Army's attitude of not really caring about their horses and that of the general public, because, of course, this was a period where animal rights movement in Britain was really coming to the fore. We had the 1849 Cruelty to Animals Act. Despite all of this and the slight pushback from the general public and the change of the horse's place in society, reform of equine care in the British military was pretty much non-existent at the time. The only major change that came about in the 19th century was the formation of the remount department in 1887. And this was really an attempt to help formalize the procedure of acquiring horses in the event of war, making sure the horses were suitable for the jobs that they were going to be undertaking, and of course to ensure that they were fit and ready for combat. The problem was that the next conflict came sooner than anybody had hoped, with the outbreak of the Second Boer War in 1899. And things got off to an immediately bad start. The army grossly underestimated the number of equines that they would need. Initially, they had believed they would need around about 125 cavalry horses and 250 transport mules per month. This was crazy, crazy wrong. It actually went up to thousands of animals by January 1902, so the culmination of the war. So they were out by huge, huge sums. This underestimation of the role that equines play would lay the foundations for what Lord Roberts would later describe as a gross scandal, which cast a slur on the name of Great Britain. The same problems, basically, as what happened 50 years earlier in the Crimean War occurred again. So there were problems with remounts due to this estimation of the number of horses that would be used. So pretty much any old horse or mule was shipped to South Africa, and many were quickly spent on the battlefields. A big part of this problem was that the mules and horses came from all over the world. Of course, they came from Great Britain, travelled by ship all the way to South Africa. Some also came from Argentina and Spain. These were arduous, long sea journeys, and they were packed onto ships with pretty much no adaptations for equines. Contagious disease ran rife, and many arrived in South Africa in an appalling state of health. But the need for them at the front was so desperate, there was no time for any kind of training, any kind of acclimatization, or any kind of treatment to get them fit. They were just sent straight forward to their units, again on another long journey. So they were sent by railway. And on these trains, their horses were shoved into carriages that were uncovered with no food or water stations. One sergeant from the 7th Dragoon Guards described the horses as packed like sardines, not tied up, and that it was positively cruel. So obviously, sending unfit horses into battle means that their lifespan in the field is going to be very short. On top of that, there was absolutely no consideration given to the fact that imported horses into South Africa had very different needs to horses that were native to South Africa. So, for example, bringing a horse over to South Africa in December, you're going to have a different climate. So the British horses arrived with thick coats, couldn't cope with the heat in South Africa, couldn't cope with the diet that was available in South Africa. So again, malnutrition, death was a huge, huge problem and very difficult to avoid given the lack of foresight. One Boer soldier actually later wrote that the British cavalrymen might well have used elephants, such was the disadvantage of their colossal horses. Those brought in from Argentina and Spain fared pretty much just as poorly because they were not used to English tack, English methods of riding. British soldiers jumped on them and expected them to behave exactly the same as native mounts, and of course they didn't. And all of this contributed to a terrible attitude and a terrible relationship really between the men and their horses. The lifespan was so short, the men didn't really have a chance to bond with the animals, and very little effort was made by the British Army itself to encourage good care and good horsemastership among soldiers. There's a quote from one chap, P.T. Ross, who memoirs A Yeoman's Letters, wrote that of his horse, "He is very useful to me as a means of locomotion, but otherwise no good feeling exists between us." And that really summarizes the kind of relationship that the guys had with their horses. Very difficult to confirm exact wastage figures during the Boer War because, unsurprisingly, the records were not particularly well kept because horses were viewed as disposable anyway, basically. But it's fair to say they probably equaled that of the Crimean War. So not much progress in 50 years there. So obviously, we're at the end of the Boer War, 1902. Times are very different. And the British Army was unable to escape the consequences of their actions in the aftermath of the war. The animal rights movement in Britain had well and truly taken off, and the public were utterly outraged by the loss of horses and the stories that littered the press. And it became known as the horse wastage scandal. Such was the scale of the public pushback. In a book, How Britain Goes to War, which was all about the Elgin inquiry, which was a huge military inquiry that took place after the Boer War, an entire chapter is devoted to the tragedy of the horses, as you can see here. And in fact, this quote here, "The hideous and revolting tragedy of the torture and death wholesale of hundreds of thousands of horses." And this blame was placed squarely at the hands of the British Army. There was no two ways about it. Organisations such as the Humanitarian League and the Society of the promotion for kindness to animals, added pressure to the British Army to reform equine services. Some people even suggesting that horses should be awarded the same protection as humans under the 1864 Geneva Convention. So the strength of feeling was very much there among the British public. And all of this scrutiny really was the catalyst for this revolution in equine affairs. So this idea that the British Army had to change its attitude, it had to change the way it looked after its horses and the way it viewed them. The first thing it did was form the Army Veterinary Corps. Sort of regimental based, it had been very light touch, and there was very little behind the veterinary officers to help them in what they were doing. So they had very few resources, very little authority, and so it was no surprise that they couldn't really do much for the horses that needed their help. But the formation of the AVC saw a huge expansion in the number of veterinary officers in the army. And for the first time, it was centralised. So it became a major part of the British Army. NCOs and other ranks were trained for the very first time as well to help the veterinary officers in their duties. And they were dedicated primarily to the care of horses, but all animals in the army, but primarily horses, and were given increased rates of pay to encourage them to do the best possible job they could. Veterinary hospitals were formed in Woolwich and Aldershot in the UK to support what they were doing and their training. And there was a huge financial investment in keeping on top of scientific developments and technology that could improve the treatment of wounded horses in war. The idea behind this was quite simple. If you invest in the horse's care, they are going to give you better value as an army. And so, you know, the idea of preventative veterinary medicine really hit the British Army for the first time. As well as that, there were improvements internally in the army to ensure that there were adequate stores available for the treatment of animals, provisions of veterinary equipment, that kind of thing. And they worked alongside civilian organisations as well to gain expertise. This restructuring essentially empowered equine services and provided a real solid base for the treatment and care of animals throughout the army that they previously had lacked. And this indirectly strengthened the relationship between soldiers and their horses, because it provided a recognition that they were more than just disposable assets. They were more than just a tool in a soldier's toolkit, but that they were comrades and they required care to get the best from them. It led to absolutely incredible success. This photo here is from the First World War. You can see a team of a couple of veterinary officers with some soldiers helping to carry out an operation, small-scale operation to remove shrapnel on one of the horses. And the success of the Army Veterinary Corps during the First World War was simply phenomenal. By 1914, so when war broke out, the AVC had around about 360 officers, and a further 1,300 or so were commissioned throughout the war. But by the end of the war in 1918, the AVC had expanded in other ranks, so NCOs and soldiers who were working in the Army Veterinary Corps, to 41,000 people. So a huge, huge number. And that's compared to, I don't know, I think there was around about 70 veterinary officers that went to Crimea. So, you know, you can see that the change there. Other things that were done, so there were many, many veterinary hospitals were set up in France and Belgium, and of course further afield in Mesopotamia and other places in the World War. Mobile veterinary sections were established as well, so they would help evacuate sick and wounded horses to the hospitals. You know, these kind of things really were parallel to how men were being treated. So they had their own casualty evacuation, clearing stations, really, really complex chain. And they treated things like illness and contagious disease incredibly well. Compared to the French army, who didn't do such a good job, like the sanitary and the kind of conditions in the veterinary hospitals for the British Army were impeccable. To possibly have a contagious disease, they were isolated, and it really kind of hasn't changed much today in the way that these things are treated. That's how advanced it was at the time. Just one more thing, of course, that the ABC did I've got some stats there, I think, on the screen. Yeah, so It's actually 2.5 million animals retrieved and where they would come from. The first major thing to come out of this was a national horse census in the UK to get a feel for the equine landscape in Britain, what kind of horses would be available and how many to the army if war would break out. And there were other procurement plans. So as part of this, the British Army looked at a variety of different schemes as to how they would acquire those horses. So they had things like boarding out, where they would own the horses, board them out to civilians for a fee, and then take them back when they needed them. They had a requisition scheme, which was the other way around. So you could register your horse with the British Army, and you get paid something like 10 shillings a year for the kind of average horse, and up to £4 a year for horses that were suitable for artillery. So quite a big sum, according to the time. The idea being that if war would break out, for that fee, you would give up your horse to the military. And then finally, there was impressment. So this idea that the British Army could take your horse if they needed it, which actually they didn't do too much of. There's a bit of a mythology around that the British countryside was stripped of all its heavy horses, which is not true, but that's a talk for another time. Apart from the domestic market, it became obviously quite obvious to those in the planning of all of this that there wasn't enough, or there would not be enough horses in Britain to support the agricultural industry in the event of a war and support fighting formations in Europe. And so remount commissions were sent all over the world to carry out reports to understand what the international horse market looked like at the time and to negotiate on access to those markets for Britain. The most important of those places was North America, so Canada and the US. We ended up, I think, around about 700,000 horses and mules came from North America at the time, during the First World War, and it was quite a battle, actually, in the years before the First World War between Germany and Britain as to who could gain access to that market and who the Americans were happy to sell to. The other big thing, of course, was this document here. So this is a codification and the actual formalization of rules for remount officers who previously had just acted off their own backs, looking at a horse like, yeah, that's all right. No, none of that was gone. The army said, these are the type of horses we want. These are the types of horses that you're allowed to buy, and these are the prices that we're going to put forward for them. And this leaflet, types of horses suitable for army remounts, didn't just specify desired conformation and physical attributes, but also, interestingly, temperament. So remount officers were told to reject horses that might be unmanageable, horses that were vicious. So there was a deeper understanding here of the individual attributes of horses as well. And all of this would ensure fewer unnecessary equine casualties in war and make sure that the British Army was provided with the best quality of horses, not just the right quantity. And it all worked out incredibly well. In the first 12 days of the First World War, the British Army's horse stocks rose from 25,000 up to 165,000. To supply the 4 new armies that had been sent to war, they would need another 245,000 horses and mules. And so the international market came into play, and particularly the United States. Between 1914 and 1918, 500 to 1,000 horses and mules were shipped to Europe from the US every 1.5 days. So, as I say, around about 700,000 in total from the US and Canada. They were shipped on specially designed ships and subject to strict veterinary examinations, quarantine. So gone were the days of the Boer War when they were shoved onto any old vessel. An awful lot of thought and investment went into the adaptation of shipping for horses, bringing the wastage down on these sea journeys to just 2%. So only 2% of animals perished on those journeys, which is incredible. Once they arrived in the UK, so they're rarely shipped straight to the front line. They came to the UK first, and they went to specialist remount depots that had been set up to bring the horses back to fitness, make sure they were acclimatized, train them, make sure they were in good health, and really do all the things that the British Army failed to do in the Boer War before sending them out to Europe and further afield. The remount department, again, were a great success during the First World War and managed to maintain a strength of between 600 and 800,000 horses and mules in service in the British Army at any one time between 1915 and 1918. So again, another staggering figure. The third change, and probably the most important change from my perspective, is the change in the regular soldiers' attitude towards their animals. And this is covered in a paper that I wrote called The Equine Learning Curve, and it's part of a wider British military history idea of the British Army going through a learning process during the First World War and to develop how it fought. And a large part of this that came to be recognised was that soldiers that had a better bond with their animals were more efficient fighting soldiers, and actually military operations got done better and quicker if our animals were in good health. And bearing in mind that 70% of all horses in the First World War served in transportation roles, that's where a lot of my research has focused. The cavalry were still used in the First World War, and actually to great effect, even on the Western Front. But transportation was where it was really at, and most of the animals ended up under the remit of the Army Service Corps. In 1914, members of the Army Service Corps were pretty well acquainted with horses, but as the size of the military began to grow, there was a dilution of skills. And so crash courses in training for new recruits were set up. And these covered things like recognizing illness in horses, basic stable management, grooming, tack and horse care. And the Army made real strides to retain and bolster the institutional equine knowledge as the original members of the ASC unfortunately perished. So they appealed to men in civilian world. They put out advertising campaigns to appeal to men who worked in hunting, racing, to join the ASC. They created specialist courses to instruct officers and NCOs on animal management that were delivered at veterinary hospitals. So combining the transportation with veterinary care, so that it wasn't just the vets, it wasn't just the horses and equines didn't just rely on veterinary services for their care, but actually the average soldier. And this was really helpful in the lines of communication. So, those photos and images you see of horses loaded up with carriages and carrying munitions in the First World War, those long lines of communications to supply the front line, actually a lot of the animal care was done by the ASC soldiers themselves. And yeah, again, this really just highlighted the fact that the animals were the responsibility of everybody, not just those serving in the ASC. With men drawn in from civilian equine industries as well, they brought a wealth of additional knowledge to bolster this care, and actually were sent to other areas of the army, so the infantry as well, to help with animal care. The success of this initiative led to the role of horse advisors, which were appointed to direct corps and divisions on horse mastership and the best way to work with animals. And there was strict punishment for misdemeanors. So anybody caught being cruel to their animals, to deliberately abusing them, were taken extremely seriously, to the point where pay was docked and you could even be demoted for not looking after, not putting your horse first, essentially. All of this sought to really kind of strengthen the bond between man and horse. And a lot of it came from the top as well. So the Quartermaster General, he was a horseman. He had a very good understanding of equines. And for him, it was vital that was pushed downwards and also laterally out in the army. And we saw things like actually the individual attributes of the horses and their needs being taken into account, not just basic care. So horses that were sent from Australia, so some of the whalers that ended up in Europe, quite a few, but some of them, and places like Argentina, they were given rugs for the winter in France because they were not used to the climate. So we saw this very kind of this detailed understanding of animal behavioral science and individual needs being brought into effect. And there was, there's a lot to be said, which, I kind of won't go anymore because I know my time is running short, but there's a lot to be said for actually taking it even more down to the micro level and looking at the personalities of individual horses and how those horses could be used in war. So, there's many examples of soldiers starting to rely on horses that could, for example, identify enemy aircraft from Allied aircraft. And there are dozens of these kind of tales. The British Army encouraged troops to do this. If they noted that a particular horse had a particular strength, use that. Don't ignore it. Don't try and force it into another box. Use these animals as comrades and view them as fellow soldiers, essentially. These kind of examples litter war diaries and really speak to this institutional effort to ensure that the animals were given not only basic care, but the very best care. And in fact, some argue that they were treated even better than men in the First World War. I'm just going to finish on this photo, which for me sums up the distance gone by the British Army and where it ended in the First World War. This is a photo from one of the regimental kind of shows behind the lines that were used to boost morale, but they were also used to strengthen the bond between man and beast. So thank you for listening. Sorry, it's been a bit of a whirlwind. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ping me an email. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And I know I cannot stay, but I really like the idea of this shifting balance between tools versus comrades. I think it comes through different times and periods that we see individuals valuing their horses as comrades rather than tools. And of course, we know that horses can be extremely useful with different personalities, and if you value this, they can be extremely useful as well as comrades if you don't try to force them into a different box. And Miriam has a comment about rugs, New Zealand rug. Okay, it's interesting. Yes, so thank you, and we really appreciate that you are coming with your cold and everything. I hope your horses are doing better as well.
Yeah, they're on the mend. They've both had salmonella, but it's been a stressful few weeks. But yeah, they're on the mend, thankfully.
Okay, yes. Thank you. So if you need to drop out, we understand that. Okay, and now we have our third and final paper from Jurg Gassmann, with whom we had a long and successful collaboration, both as presenter and as author of publications published by Treitise Equine and Equestrian History series. So Jurg is a lawyer by training and profession, and he's an unaffiliated research published on the history of horses in Western Europe, their depiction in European literature, breeding and training and use, as well as military history with a particular focus on medieval and Swiss military and political organization. And today he is going to speak about Swiss cavalry, right, Jurg? So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay.
So we are going back in time a little bit, just in between.
Yes, in between, the in-between time. Now, I need to move this. Right. So my proposition is you cannot have one without the other, and I will explain what I mean by that by the end of the talk. Basically, Switzerland flunked cavalry until 1850, until the federal government. Now, Swiss had a very high military reputation. The Swiss successes in the Burgundian War, especially Swiss heavy infantry, was famous throughout Europe. We also fought in the Italian wars, and incidentally, we killed Pietro del Monte. So sorry, Pierre-Henry, that's our fault. So this reputation, high reputation for Swiss infantry, remained until Napoleon. The crossing of the Berezina was effected by Swiss infantry. The Swiss also acquired and developed artillery through this period, but we were always weak in cavalry. So why? Why was this cavalry weakness? There are two basic arguments. One is Switzerland is not conducive to raising horses. Now, this is just plain wrong. There were famous studs in Switzerland in the high Middle Ages. Einsiedeln, for instance, bred horses that were famous into northern Italy. They were known as the Cavalli della Madonna. And we exported horses into early modern times to various armies around us. And after 1850, after we founded the founding of the federal state of Switzerland, we developed our own horse studs that very successfully supplied the Swiss army as the still known as the Franche-Montagne or Freiberger breed of horses. So the other argument is that Switzerland's heavy infantry was so strong that the Swiss did not need cavalry. Now, this is also wrong, but it is a bit more complicated. We'll have to take a step back and look at the structure of the Swiss Confederation to understand why this is so. So what did the Swiss Confederation from the 16th century to Napoleon look like? We had 13 full-member cantons. All of the full-member cantons considered them princes or Reichsfürsten within the Holy Roman Empire. They were all of them republican, and by the end of the 15th century, they were governed by the end of the 15th century, our senior nobility, that is, the counts, duke and above, had died out in Switzerland. Autonomous knights were either mediatized or absorbed into the cantonal patriciates. And the rest of Switzerland, so outside of these 13 full-member cantons, there were subject territories, essentially colonies that were ruled by the full members and exploited by the full members. And then there were also associate members. Now, I'll show some maps of Switzerland just to show you a bit the diversity of Switzerland. These are the language boundaries. So the brownish red is German, the blue in the west is French, and the green in the south is Italian. And then the light brown, that's Romansh. It is a Latin dialect, a bit similar to Ladine in northern Italy. These are the confessional boundaries, green Catholic, and the reddish brown is Protestant. These are cultural boundaries. Proper Swiss play with German cards of bells, roses, shields, and acorns. And the other Swiss, they play with the French set of the Italian set. So it's carreau, cœur, pique, trèfle. So there's also culinary boundaries, and just want to explain this. This is constitutional organization. The ones in light blue, those are the cantons that have a Landsgemeinde, where the whole population comes together to vote by show of hands. The ones in purple, those are patriciates. The ones in blue are governed by guilds. The green ones are the subject territories, and the other colors are associate members who all have a different form of organization. So this is just to explain. This is what the 13 cantons looked like in the 18th century. So the boundaries are a bit different, but these are the 13 full member cantons that were governing Switzerland. So you can see, if you try to keep these maps a bit in your visual eye, there is no commonality. Every single border every single category you might want to choose runs through these the various cantons. There's such a great diversity. Now, the military constitutions, there's one commonality. All the cantons relied on militia. There was no standing force in Switzerland. The arms and equipment, including the horse for cavalry, were owned by the soldier and kept at home. There were arsenals. That's where the heavy arms, like the cannon, were kept, but there were no barracks. So there was no place to accommodate a unit, a military unit. If they had maneuvers, they used their tents, but there were no barracks. And also there were no mercenaries. The Swiss were mercenaries throughout Europe, but the Swiss cantons themselves did not hire mercenaries. It's just too expensive. With the infantry and artillery, the cantons could draw on expertise of officers and other ranks who were serving as mercenaries abroad, and the officers were drawn from the patriciate families for these officers that were sent as mercenaries. The experience the Swiss had, military experience they had, is the lack of cavalry meant they could not exploit victories. This is the case in Granson. They beat the Burgundians, but the Burgundian army remained intact, retreated to the Lausanne, re-equipped themselves, and were back 2 months later for the Battle of Morat. Now, in Battle of Morat is a great Swiss victory, which we only won because the Habsburgs sent about 1,200 cavalry and supplied all the experienced officers. Now, we did most of the infantry fighting, but it would not have been possible without a large heavy cavalry complement, which was supplied by the Habsburgs. And then Marignano is a battle we lost because we had no cavalry. The cavalry was captured a month earlier through a daring French raid. And so on the day of the battle itself, we had no cavalry to disrupt Francois I's guns or to protect against the threatened Venetian cavalry attack in the flank on the second day of the battle. So that meant the Swiss had to withdraw from the field. So cavalry was important. We understood cavalry was important. And they tried to get cavalry set up. So one option was by census. So somebody who can afford to equip themselves as a cavalryman was obliged to serve in the cavalry. But what they found out is the men with high census tended to be advanced in age, unfit, and unadventurous. And they had a business to run, so they were usually not very interested in serving. So another option was volunteers, highly motivated, but their availability is unreliable. If they're volunteers, they may decide they will not show up. And you have no control over their equipment, training, or armaments. They show up with whatever they want to bring, and they don't take orders well because they are volunteers. Another option was mercenaries, but mercenaries are extremely expensive. So then where would they be based? This was probably the even greater problem than the cost, because there were no facilities to accommodate a large number of horses. Now, the whole point of having cavalry is that they are a rapid reaction force. What the Swiss would usually do is they parcel them out, a few dozen here, a few dozen there. Of course, that doesn't work for a cavalry unit. They're difficult to control. This was also extremely important for the Swiss. They had no cavalry officers of their own within their cantonal governments who knew how to handle cavalry. And so they were at the mercy of the cavalry officers that were mercenaries. And they were very afraid that they would go rogue and try to capture one of the cantons, for instance, and set themselves up just like Condottieri had done in Italy. So a further option was feudal cavalry. We tried all these options, all at the same time. Everything was tried. So the problem was in most cantons, the cantonal, the rulers had subverted the feudal order and in order to set up an absolutist government with a subject where the inhabitants were subjects. They were not free feudal yeomen, but subjects. So this made a feudal cavalry impossible. Now there's an exception. Bern in 1536 conquered part of the Duchy of Savoy, which is today the Canton of Vaud. And there they inherited the cavalry structure of the Dukes of Savoy. For about 200 years, this remained the only reliable reservoir of cavalry for the Canton of Bern. Now, of course, the Canton of Bern itself was a republic, so they couldn't really keep these feudal structures alive, just like they would have been kept alive in a duchy. So gradually, these cavalry structures they inherited, the feudal structures decayed, and by the end of the period, they started off with about, I think, 300, and by the end of the period, it was between 100 and 150 that they could still raise by this method. So this was true in Bern until the second half of the 18th century. As I said, there was decay of the feudal institutions under Republican rule. The next effort would have been a joint effort. What if the cantons would have banded together to raise indigenous cavalry or even pay for mercenaries? But there was no political unity. Whatever canton would have the cavalry would have an immeasurable military advantage over the cantons that did not have cavalry. And by now we were fighting amongst each other, Catholics versus Protestants and other political issues. So this was a non-starter. Standing troops were not part of the constitution to begin with. We would need to agree command, sharing of cost of purchase, with sharing of cost of maintenance, and there were no facilities to accommodate them. So, and again, we had no experience in control or command within the governments of these Swiss cantons. So the eventual solution was the Swiss gave up on battlefield cavalry. Instead, we had small numbers of light cavalry. This was especially Bern and Zurich managed to raise light cavalry, though there were also problems there. Light cavalry they're not armored. You don't need battlefield formation training. It is more raiding, reconnaissance, that type of assignment. So you could have young adventurous recruits, which you could get from tillage farms and livery stables. They could bring their horses. The horses did not specifically have to be trained in these heavy cavalry maneuvers and battlefield formations and with heavy cavalry arms. That worked. Bern in 1799, so this was just before the Napoleonic invasion, the population of the canton of Bern with all its subject territories was about 400,000. The army fully mobilized. This includes navy. We had navy on Lake Geneva and Lake Neuchâtel and so on. Fully mobilized was 78,000, of which the cavalry was 1,000. There's 4 regiments of 250. So that was the grand total of cavalry. Of course, there were a lot more horses. The artillery had a lot of horses. Transport had a lot of horses. But in terms of fighting cavalry, 4 regiments of light cavalry. This is all. So what did the Swiss do instead? Instead, the Swiss pursued a deliberate policy of armed neutrality. They established and actually implemented, even though they had massive internal debates, they actually implemented procedures for mobilizing infantry and artillery in times of border threats. This was during the 30 Years' War, 1618-48, where all the belligerents around Switzerland were involved in the war. This was in the crisis when France took over the Franche-Comté, which had been Habsburg. This was during the War of the Austrian Succession, early 18th century. So this we were able to do. We got our act together to do this, but cavalry was not possible. Then we also allowed troops to freely view our military preparations, our fortifications, our arsenals, our military training exercises. Anybody could come and watch and look. And the intent was to show everybody around that you may be able to conquer us, but you'll never be able to hold. And there was active diplomacy. Switzerland, of course, is a very strategic location, and we assured everybody around that we would remain neutral and we'd protect our territory, so that every power on one side could rely on it, that the power on the other side would not be able to occupy Switzerland. So the conclusion: cavalry is expensive, cavalry is powerful, 13 to 15 trained remounts every year to maintain the strength. So this is an enormous logistical and training and infrastructure effort. But functional high nobility is incompatible with republican government. Switzerland had no high nobility left in Switzerland from the 16th century onwards. And so to me, that means you can't have the one without the other. If you wanted cavalry in the early modern times, you needed to be able to base it on structure of senior, of high nobility, who had the inclination and the infrastructure to maintain a large number of trained horses. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jurg. So I think you made a very good explanation of what you need to have cavalry. So sort of clear. Why not? Why yes? Okay, so open floor. No people have questions, comments, I think. Yeah. It's kind of very, very interesting how you need a very rigid organization if you have large amounts of horses and you need to have them uniform, sort of. Okay. But I'm just wondering about this argument that Switzerland cannot breed horses. Why people are making this argument? I don't know. Like they can breed cows.
Well, because they're trying to.
Horses.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I've seen it. I've also seen it with Swiss historians who have argued that they're trying to explain, because otherwise there's what is the explanation, and that's essentially why I got into this research, and I think I'm right in my assessment. It is of course true that in certain parts of Switzerland, in the Bernese Oberland, for instance, there were discussions because they said we can't supply horses, and of course the road network was a lot less well developed in those times, and there were parts of Bern where there was no road access from the valleys to. You had to go down to the lake, go on a boat, go along the lake, and then get off at the other end of the lake. There was no road connections. They said this is not practically feasible for us to contribute to the cavalry. But I mean, even now, the Freiberger horses are very robust and common. So it's not a good argument. And we exported a lot of horses in the 17th and 18th century.
Okay, so question from Hilger, comment about pack horses. And then, okay, you can answer this, and then Emma could make a comment on Lucy's presentation. She has one. Yeah, Jurg, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, the question on pack horses was for me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. There were lots of pack horses. I mean, this is obviously at the time, nearly the entire traffic across the passes was on pack horses. But again, the Gotthard, there was no road across the Gotthard until the late 19th century. If you came across the Gotthard, you went to Flüelen, you had to transfer to a ship, to a boat, and then go take the boat up to Lucerne on the other end of the Vierwaldstätter See, Lake Lucerne. There was no direct road connection. So no.
Okay, Hilke, did you have
There was
something
lots of.
to say? Yes, Hilke also wanted.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you guys can hear me. That's why I put the question in the chat, because I'm on the way with the train and everything. But yeah, I find it actually that I think that strengthens your argument, because I remember Jack telling us about his experience working with those pack horses in the military, that they did actually have equines in the military, but there was no like cavalry sort of thing. So it strengthens your argument that it was a specific reason that there was no cavalry. It wasn't due to a lack of horses or anything like that.
Correct. That's
Yeah,
I mean,
let's find that very interesting.
for a Bernese expedition to Italy in the late 15th century, I think they had a train of 1,500 pack horses and mules to transport their supplies. So no, there couldn't.
Very interesting and fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Emma had a comment on Lucy's presentation. So Emma, you here? You can make that comment.
I think she was saying about the First World War and the Boer Wars as well. I think Lucy gave some statistics of wastage of between 33 to 44%, with the French and the Germans not having as adequate a veterinary corps as England. I was certainly looking at some of the household retinues that could have up to several hundred horses, and I was getting about 33 to 50% of horses being on the march. Far less in battle, quite a lot on chevauchés, but mostly on the march, particularly if a campaign extended into winter. And I'm looking at campaigns mostly in Scotland. So it was quite a difficult area, and the weather was fairly inclement as well. Horses were evacuated out of Scotland, so they were taken out of the war zones, normally in small groups, and they took them down the old pack horse routes out of Scotland, usually towards York. They couldn't use the main roads because you had the Scottish forces marauding, and they were particularly vulnerable to attack. So they tended to not travel with the main army because they were a lot slower with the sick and wounded horses. So they travelled them down the highways and byways. They still lost about 50% of those anyway. So yes, there was medical attention for the horses, but that was probably because at this time, war horses belonging to men at arms were insured. So the Crown had a vested interest in keeping these horses going anyway. But yeah, I thought it was very interesting to see the parallels and the fact that not a lot changed until they instigated this veterinary corps. And I think it was really poignant as well that she pointed out that horses were seen as disposable assets. And I agree. And I think that goes throughout history when it comes to warfare. But she also made the point that they never had time to connect with their horses. And perhaps that created this distance between them as well. And I think that's possibly why there was this disconnect between soldiers and their horses. That doesn't mean that every soldier or every medieval man at arms didn't care for his horse. I'm not saying that, but it gives a reason why there might be this distance if there's this fast turnaround. And there was in the medieval wars as well. There was never enough remounts. There was never enough horses to replace the ones that they'd lost. But no, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, Jean-Pierre, you wanted to also make a comment? Yeah.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, fine.
Good evening from South Africa. It's a bit warmer, I think, where I am than where most of you are today. Just a comment. Obviously, the Boer forces, the two Boer republics at the beginning of the Anglo-Boer War, they absolutely looked after their horses. Because remember, every soldier that reported for duty brought his own horse with him. This was like part of his family. This was an incredibly important part of his livelihood. So for the Boer armies, unlike the British army, their horses were incredibly valuable to them as individuals and collectively, because the Boer army at the turn of the century was between 40 and 60,000 strong horsemen. And without their horses, there was no way that those 60,000 horsemen could have been able to survive 3 years of fighting literally the entire British Empire. So while the British army might have not been particularly caring for their horses, it was exactly the opposite on the Boer side. They were trying everything in their power to keep their horses as well and as looked after as what the situation and wartime situation would allow them to. So just a comment from my side of that. Not every military was so blatant with their horses. Some militaries actually cared a great deal about their animals, specifically if your lives depended upon it, as what the Boer soldiers during the Anglo-Boer War obviously did. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, there are societies where they have very well established veterinary care. Even in the Middle Ages, I will remember I was reading Timothy Dawson's book on the Byzantine army, and he mentioned there that they already at this stage they had veterinary care for horses and vets going with the army. And so both for men who could be injured and for horses, they could offer some help within, of course, within what they could do at the time. And yes, Miriam was commenting that it's interesting regarding the veterinary station with the French cavalry, because in France they had good veterinary knowledge. And was a French veterinarian who set up the veterinary college in London, and it was focusing on horses. So it's another interesting point. More comments? Okay, Miriam. Yeah, we know that you have a storm coming in Scotland, so.
Yeah, us as well.
Okay, I have a kind of common question to Pierre-Henry, and when I was reading Pietro del Monte's Collectanea, I have a feeling, as compared to some other books of the time, like Dom d'Arte's Book of Horsemanship, you have a feeling that for Pietro Monte, horses are kind of very secondary in importance. He has one section where he says, like one chapter where he says that you shouldn't duel on horseback because it's no good. And I mean, like, I'm not a good expert on Pietro Monte. That's my impression. What is your feeling about it? How he feels about horses and horseback fighting? Yeah, you get my question?
Oh, can you repeat the question, please?
So my question is I have an impression that for Pietro Monte, horses are not secondary in importance, and horses and horseback fighting, and he's more into like fighting on foot. What is your impression about his books?
Yes. To write an article about Pietro Monte and to compare with Don Rosset, we have not the same type of stuff. And today I have said maybe not all, but a lot of things about that we can find in Pietro Monte books. And we don't have a lot of techniques, and we have good principles, but not of techniques. And is more specialized to foot fighting, of course. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Same. People have more questions or comments on this? All right, if people don't have questions or comments, I think it's Thursday evening. People have a lot of pressing concerns and or just feeding ponies and so on. So let's thank our two speakers and Lucy remotely, and really grateful for you to come here and present your research. I think there was quite a lot in common, despite the fact that it's different cultures and different historical periods. So let's give some virtual applause, and yeah, thank you. So I'll stop